Well, Leo got to know Eric de Vries in one of the camps, earlier camps, but then they lost track of each other. But Eric de Vries had not forgotten him and had memorized most of the poems up to the time that they split ways. And when he was in Holland, he went to a literary meeting where Simon Vestdijk, which was a really important person at that time, was present, and he said the greatest poet, whatever, is dead, and he started declaiming the poetry, but he also had my address. And so he wrote to me, and he wrote in a very tactful way, not knowing that Leo was still alive. And so then I got to meet him, and at that time he had developed tuberculosis, and he was in a sanatorium, which in those days treated tuberculosis by fresh air. And there he was in the fresh air, and it was shortly after the war, and Uncle Leo had sent us from Israel, from Palestine, a big box of oranges. And so we kept some, but we also, dealt them out. So I brought him a little bag of oranges.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think he ever remembered that.
So, but didn't Eric contact you at some point and to tell you that didn't he?
Well, she got a letter from Eric. Yeah, that's
but didn't he? But he at that point didn't he think that you had not survived?
Well, that's what I said. He knew. He sent me. No, he took the initiative, and he sent me a very tactful letter, not knowing whether Leo had survived or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I could write to him, and by that time Leo was already being published.
Mm-hmm. So when you were back to what year are we now that you were switching to Museum of Natural History and
in 1958.
Okay.
And while I was starting there, we could go to Holland with our children, both Peggy and Jerry, and Tineke had the bright idea of trying to show you the long distance. So instead of flying, we took the ship, and I don't know if the children had a good time on board, but anyway, it was a good experience, I think. Then in Holland,
and we did see the Aurora Borealis.
Yeah.
Yes, we got
and I do remember that it was a good experience, and I do remember that very clearly. I was only 6 years old then, or 5 or 6.
It was a loose tooth.
Yeah.
The surprising thing to me was that these promotions for PhD are a public affair in Holland, and you have 2 paranymphs, as they call it, one on each side of you, theoretically to catch you when you faint or something like that. And so I had picked my own dear wife as one, and a colleague, a fellow student from way back, Titia Koistra, as the other paranymph. And so there we were, standing, and what you had to do when the Bidal announces the professors coming in and on. But what struck me was it was very crowded. And people didn't look like biologists, they looked like poets and our newspaper people, and that's what they were. So then I realized that people did read my stuff.
And is that the first time you realized that you were actually, that it really struck you that you had were creating a name for yourself with your
not
poetry?
really, because I got got 3 or 4 awards before them.
But that was the first time we went back to Mons.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the questions by the professor were also partly silly, pretending I was a poet, pretending to be a biologist or something like that. But I kept it straight. I think I was interested in the work I did. And then, well, the work in the museum was fascinating. I mentioned the exact dating of the PhD because the law was that you could deduct for a trip in relation to your work if it did not lead to a promotion. So I was under the impression that I was hired in the museum, notwithstanding that I didn't have a PhD yet. And we had to make that declaration, and it was signed by the head of the Animal Behavior Department. And that later said, well, actually it's not true. And we knew you were going to get your PhD, otherwise we wouldn't have taken you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
You can't always be honest.
so
Anyway,
but we did not deduct it.
the work was very tricky. This was a study on the effect of early experience on later adaptation to stress in rats. And it implied that you could never touch a rat with your hands. A rat that happened to escape for a moment was immediately out because that was an unlisted experience, and so on. And
An unauthorized adventure.
yes, and the result of, as we discussed what we could do with these rats, expanded into, well, if we do this, it would be a shame if we didn't also do that. And the end result was each rat was worth about $3,000. So
Which in the late 50s was a sizable amount. That was a third of your salary.
yes, and I let one escape once. And Esther Torbach asked me why I did that, because he is a psychologist and she felt sure I intended to.
Yeah, nothing goes without
Premeditation.
premeditation.
But we did get probably interesting results. I did, with colleagues, I developed a test to measure in the adrenals cholesterol and ascorbic acid at the same time. And it worked very well, except it exploded sometimes. And we had to do it under a hood where it exploded safely. But of all the measurements we did, we came to the end of the grand period with tapes. We had a punch machine, a Freedom tape puncher. They made so much noise that we needed a long cable away from the rats so we didn't hear it. It was all very complicated. And we wound up with a big box full of tapes and no grant to analyze the results.
And to this day, they still sit at
Yes.
the museum unanalyzed.
There was a movie at the time, Cripps' Last Tape, and I had a picture of Ethel Torbach looking at something called The Tape's Last Crap.
So during the time of the Museum of Natural History work, what were you doing? We had started school, Jerry and I, and what kinds of things were you involved in?
Dr. Me?
Yes.
No, I did not start school.
No,
They
we
started.
started school.
They,
Oh, the kids started school. Yes, of course. Well, there was another thing that was rather sad. You know, when Leo was accepted at Columbia and we moved and we rented an apartment, Columbia had a very nice program, a pre-kindergarten program, and it was highly recommended. we asked could they have Jerry, and yes, and it was free for people, for students. So we were all set up, a school for Jerry to go to, and an apartment, and the study that Leo was going to do, and then everything fell apart. And fortunately, the job situation was resolved, but the school was not. And so we talked to the people and said, well, you're not being part of Columbia, so she cannot come. And I really felt that each step kind of denied something for your and Jerry's benefit. And then somebody said, the public school is not bad here. And then we decided, well, what choice do we have? And we really had good experiences. 125, I think it was.
And that was on the edge of Harlem, actually.
Yeah,
it
it
was
was
123rd Street. And
But the thing was that Columbia, a lot of people from Columbia sent their children to that school, and they kind of provided certain benefits. There was a music program that they paid for, and the people that went to school, you had all kinds of people. You had people from Harlem, and you had people from Columbia there, and it was a nice mix, and I felt very much at home there, and I decided that one of the reasons I didn't even think of looking for work was that I didn't know anything about schools, and I had heard bad things about United States schools. So I felt that the least I could do was become a volunteer and see what was going on. And I was pleasantly surprised. And I think I have kept that up until Jerry went to high school, and then I really stopped doing. But I still did it when you went to that middle school.
I do remember the school in Manhattan as being ethnically very diverse. I was very young, but I remember the tremendous diversity there, and I think there was never any question about feeling accepted. The fact that we were of an immigrant family didn't seem to mean anything.
No.
Not there. And I think only after we moved did I realize in retrospect the difference in this more diverse environment versus a more kind of a single, more of a single culture that we moved into. But we'll get to that later. So you were involved in volunteering in the schools, and you were doing this.
And every time I went in the volunteer business, I started selling cake or something, and I always ended up in the board.
That's very good progress to make.
Yes, it was. And I think I was the secretary of the district of the different schools, because there's also the office of the district, not the school, but the school district was in that building, and I was representing our school in that, and things like that.
Yeah. And so this went on until, how long were you at the museum?
Only from 1958 to 61. And then my grant ran out, as I said, and then the same Uncle Snapper got me a job at the Brooklyn VA hospital with the pathologist there. He was a nice guy. And they would take me if I would apply for a grant that was successful. So I wrote one, including wanting an ellipsometer, of course, of my own. And after a while, they called us and we said, well, it was accepted. So we moved to Brooklyn. The husband of an assistant of Uncle Snapper drove us around, asked us what kind of neighborhood we wanted, and we said we wanted a mixed neighborhood because we liked the way it was in Manhattan. But he thought that we meant mixed Italian and Jewish, and he found a corresponding area.
Which was horrendous. And then he brought us to, where we actually lived.
Sheepshead Bay area.
And that was a very good choice, I think.
Talking about races, I think, I don't know if I mentioned that when I was 6 and there was this circus across the street, and we went to a sideshow with my parents. I was no more than 6 years old, and I admired the very tall black people, very black people, and I assumed they were Maasai, and one of them embraced me, and I still remember that feeling that I had never been home before. I was finally home. So I had the same feeling, I think, when we lived close to Harlem.
Mm-hmm.
We had a black neighbor lady who was one of the first activists, I think, in the black movement. A wonderful woman.
Mm-hmm.
And
She was not.
well, yeah, she was. She was a nut. But
Mm-hmm.
She was very impressive.
yeah.
Well, when you moved to, or when we moved to Brooklyn, to Sheepshead Bay, which was even at that time more suburban in a way, not the heart of the city. And again, you were renting an apartment. Did you ever have any desire to pursue what is perceived as more of the American dream of owning a home, and had you considered that rather than living in an apartment?
Yes, we did. As a matter of fact, when we were still in Brooklyn, and we really had not a very clear idea of the grant system that could stop any time. So when we had the children and we thought, this was going to be our life, we looked around to a few houses, and fortunately none of them really suited us very well. So we didn't commit ourselves, and it was a good thing we didn't.
And why was that?
Well, because buy a house and then being fired, that's what happened.
We had only 3 years to live each time.
Oh,
So
okay. I mean, but you didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was in retrospect a very good thing that we didn't went through with buying a house.
But in retrospect, you did live in Brooklyn for many years, and
No.
36.
yeah.
But to
Brooklyn-
this day, we never had curtains because we were going to move anyway.
Well, the thing is, why didn't we buy a house in Brooklyn was another story, because we were satisfied with what we had.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then you were growing up, and as it really turned out, eventually we had a large apartment which we really didn't quite need, and it was nice to have family staying with us, but
Well, I mean, it was, and it was, by today's standards, not a large apartment, but at that time it was, and it was big enough that Jerry and I had separate rooms. But then when our grandmothers would come visit, then they would have a place to stay too, and I think that was very
that
very
was
important.
really what we wanted.
Of course, in the first apartment we had, we have not mentioned that our mothers took turns spending about half a year with us.
about every 2 years.
Every 2 years,
So-
I had a vacation in between. But in the first apartment, my mother lived behind a curtain in a very small area, so it was not too much privacy.
Well, it was doable, and she had been in a camp, and we had lived in smaller places, and it was not very important. We knew that we wouldn't live there forever, but as far as Brooklyn was concerned, if you hadn't moved here, and Jerry, being in England, it just didn't make sense anymore, and then we didn't work.
We had a moment of discrimination, I think. It is when Tineka's mother was darker than Tinek. Was with us, and we went to Washington because I had to go to a meeting. And we went to a diner. We sat three in a row, and each of us ordered a drink. And Tinek and I got our drink, but Tineka's mother didn't get anything. And I said, how about this lady? Well, she got something eventually, but there's something there.
And this was in the early 60s?
Yeah.
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 So so in Brooklyn you were proceeding as an independent researcher
Yes,
with your own lab and also writing and poet and
well, I have actually I was at the point where we moved to Brooklyn, right? And then as we moved into our apartment, we made a little walk to Shipshead Bay, and there was a phone booth. So let me call them up, and I called the hospital up, and I said, when can I start? And he said, what do you mean? Well, when can I start work? Work? Well, the grant was approved. Oh, it was approved locally, but we don't have the money yet. It has to come from Washington.
So there you were.
I actually sweated. I staggered out of the phone booth and said, I don't know what I stammered, but
No, it was not as, you were pretty
collected.
collected.
Wow.
Well,
Anyway,
I think
two weeks later
I
we...
think there's one thing you should have mentioned, that Uncle Snapper realized that he had been promoting jobs that were not permanent, and he felt that it was time for Leo to get a permanent job, and he picked the VA because that was a government job, and as a matter of fact it is a big benefit that we still have, because the government's not going to bankrupt in a hurry, let's put it that way. And
There are interesting, typical federal government little problems. I got an assistant, and I got the ellipsometer approved, and I ordered a table. You have to, wherever possible, order it through the government. But somebody who always helped me, when he found out that it would be another half a year before I got the table, because they had just built 64 tables and mine was the first for the next batch. He said, no, you should order a table with a drawer because they don't have them. And you get them immediately. So I learned that. But then the work went very well. And the ellipsometer, for example, showed exactly what I thought it would. I wrote an article for the journal Nature, but being very careful, saying, well, this indicates there is a relationship. At the same time, I wrote a poem in Dutch, very...
triumphant.
Yeah, that's the most charitable way to describe it, that I was a great person after all, and nobody could fool me, and I discovered this. It was wrong. But the article was so careful in Nature that I couldn't leave that stand. But the poem that was published already then, later I attached a note to that, frankly, this is not true, because you don't withdraw a poem, you can withdraw an article. But I was awakened when I had to give a talk in Würzburg a step for a Jewish guy, not that long after the war, that required some discussion. My mother was very much against it, but I felt, well, this was a new generation. So
And
I
what
went.
year? What year did you go to Germany?
It must have been around 1964 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first place, I started my lecture saying that I was Jewish, and this was. My feeling was that these were different people, and I could do it. Then, when I described the results I had, and I thought proved that a certain protein went on the surface and so on, a professor said, "You haven't proven that is that vector." And I said, "Well, what do you think it is?" "Well, how about fibrinogen?" he said. And it turned out that later I heard that he thought everything was fibrinogen, so that was not too surprising. But later I ran home, got anticipated fibrinogen. I discovered fibrinogen was on the surface briefly when blood contacted the surface and was a turnover. And I published a lot of articles on that, and about 15 years later, two people confirmed it finally and named it after me, the Vroman effect.
And so the Vroman effect, in summary, is a. Could you just give maybe a one sentence summary of what it is?
The Vroman effect is that when blood touches many surfaces like glass, metal, and such, would deposit first one protein and then replace it with another protein and replace that with another. So each protein would be there briefly, but the next one would be a little longer. And fibrinogen would be there for about 30 seconds. And the interesting thing of that would be that this whole blood that contains platelets, these are the little particles that stop you bleeding, the platelets would stick to the surface if they find fibrinogen there. Which means that if, for example, you expose blood to glass, the platelets will not stick because they come too late. Fibrinogen is gone already by the time they arrive. But on plastics, where it's all slower, platelets stick, and so on. So that was of some importance, maybe in artificial blood vessels.
And this observation was different from what the general belief had been at the time.
Yes.
Which was
people. The time factor was not considered. If people wanted to see what blood did on the surface, they would let it sit there for an hour, 2 hours, and then look. And it was too late.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the problem with, I could mention their names, Tom Herbert and John Brash,
mm-hmm.
were very good scientists. And once in a while I would ask them, did you find, I said, no, we didn't find any fibrinogen. Well, how long did you expose? Well, 5 minutes or so, something much too long.
Yeah. So I mean, this was so basically other researchers had been looking at the interaction of blood components on foreign surfaces as sort of a static event rather than a dynamic event.
Exactly.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, what I know that a lot of your poetry has a lot of scientific references. At what time did you start to feel that you wanted to really bring that science into those creative endeavors, or is it something that happened without you really thinking about it?
That's a good question. I think rather early. Not this is things I wrote in camp. By the way, I never wrote about these camps. I wrote about other things. I wrote a novel about Tineke living in Gouda the way I would have when I was young, and that sort of stuff. I think by the time I got some scientific results, I felt it was all one thing. I got a lot of awards. That was nice.
We got awards for your science as well as your poetry.
Yes, yeah.
And in the meantime, you when we moved to Brooklyn, what sort of activities did you get involved in with the kids in the neighborhood?
I did.
Yes.
Well, I had already become a Girl Scout leader in New York, and when I went to one of my first band meetings, they were recruiting Girl Scout leaders for the next age group, and you and Jerry had reached that age group, so I thought that would be a good idea to do, and I took you had to take a course for that, and I was a Girl Scout leader for at least another 10 years, I think. And
Could you interrupt one second? The difference between the Girl Scouts in Manhattan and in Brooklyn is interesting, I think. The kind of...
well, yeah, but that is a side issue. But basically, we moved from a metropolitan environment with all kinds of backgrounds and levels of wealth and interest. We moved to a kind of a suburban area where you had areas where Italians lived and areas where the Jewish people lived, and it was a very different kind of environment. And when we came to the school, I realized that there was a strong Jewish influence, but there was also a strong Italian Catholic influence, and they were not particularly mixing very well, and so it turned out that I was involved with the Jewish people because they happened to be in my troop. But I think that you became friends with an Italian girl, and Jerry became friends with a couple of Jewish people, and it was a very different social atmosphere, and not in every respect very pleasant.
I think it was difficult for our children to be exposed suddenly to a Jewish world where the teachers were Jewish and talked about things they had no idea what she was talking about.
Well, it was to the point that when there was a parent meeting, that the principal would make jokes, Jewish jokes, and didn't think of the few Italians that were in the audience, and that kind of thing. And the Italians were in the minority, I think. And what happened eventually was that the school, I think the school needed some more pupils, and there was a strong pressure to try to mix the schools a little better, and because they had a lot of vacancies for the students, they started busing black children from the black area to that school, and then the bus went and the bus came back and picked them up. And in the beginning, I still remember going on a trip with your class, or Jerry's class, and we were on the bridge, and a school bus passed us, and there were only black children, and all the children in our bus looked as if they were little animals, and there was big opposition to this mixing, this imposed mixing, but eventually it really changed the school, and it was eventually called, well, I don't remember the name, but the schools got names, and this
Mhm.
was an anthropologist who had done a lot of mixing different groups, and studied a lot of black people, so, and that was the name of the school.
You know, I don't know if our children will remember this tall black girl that was also a Girl Scout in Manhattan. She was the daughter of our neighbor,
Mhm. Yeah, I remember her.
and I used her as a person, and I wrote a science fiction kind of mystery novel, and in it we Jay, who liked animals even more than I did maybe, said we should not eat meat, we should grow our own meat, and I proposed to grow our own meat, and it doesn't grow well. I put my own cells in it, and Peggy goes to the butcher to get some very fresh meat, and we try to grow that, and then I decided to take my bone marrow, and they find me dead. There's a bone marrow needle in my chest, and meanwhile I think I had become friends with a black scientist whose last name was Darwin, and his parents called him Charlie, and
This was in your story,
in
or
my
in,
story, not for real, and well, anyway, it turns out that the fresh meat was actually not a cow's meat, it was the wife of the butcher. The butcher was afraid I was growing his wives, and well, we wind up with Tineke having a warm relationship with Charlie Darwin, and the green Jay accidentally sows some raw pea soup in the culture, which contains phytohemagglutinin, which stimulates the cell growth, which is true. And we get see green boys from my blood, and see green butchers' wives, and it's all very romantic.
Mhm.
But the black girl in there is actually the daughter of our neighbor.
And when did you write that?
I can look
Was
it up.
that still
I
in
have-
Manhattan,
I
or
have
was
it
it in? in Brooklyn?
I was in Brooklyn then, I think.
And so what the so I mean that's clearly an example of your science in invading your
Yeah.
your literature, but your science has also impacted your art, and that is something progressive that.
No, I began to use art to make things visible for myself. There's one drawing that's on the cover of the annals of our meeting on biomaterials. I try to imagine pulling on a cell membrane and compare that with an artificial membrane, that sort of stuff. I think, well, biologists in general are pretty good artists, and they use it as a tool of understanding what is happening. And if you can't draw it reasonably, then your theory must be wrong, that kind of thing.
So, at what time through all of this did you decide to go back to school?
I think Jerry was already studying, I think, and you were. I think you were already living on your own, and I went to a meeting, I can remember, of very outspoken feminists, and they were talking about, doing things against all odds, and being very vigilant, and being aggressive, and becoming successful, and something like that. it suddenly dawned on me that, you know, there was a future for me, because things were winding down. I was the Girl Scouts was all gone, and I had really nothing much to live for, to be very frank.
And this was in the early 70s?
Yeah, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I decided, why not go back to school? And I went to the Brooklyn College, and I thought, you know, who knows what I can accomplish. And they were very unencouraging. Now, I had a medical degree, and they said they would allow me a bachelor's degree, and in a direction that, since I stopped studying, had developed tremendously, so I did practically know nothing about it. They would, something like organic chemistry, you know. So I said to myself, that's totally ridiculous. So I got out and I got back in the subway, and I remember that I had taken just a course in what is called the New School in Manhattan, which is a kind of, it's a very interesting kind of university, originally established for the immigrant scientists from Europe who sought shelter in America. So I went there.
And when was it established? Do you remember?
Shortly after, around World War II, I think.
And two? Mm-hmm.
And you know, when Hitler started pushing the people out, or they escaped.
So it was sort of an academic haven, in a sense?
Yeah, it was. It had some connections with Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I had taken an anthropology course there, and I thought, you know, that is an interesting subject. So I went there, and I had taken my Latin diplomas along that nobody in Brooklyn College could read, but that the person I spoke to at the new school could read very well. And they said, well, why don't you try this and that and the other thing? And it turned out that I started studying anthropology. And once I was studying it, I realized that there was such a thing as medical anthropology that was developing at those days, and now it is a very big specialty. So I studied anthropology, but I always, for each course, I liked to find, we had to write a paper as a, you know, to complete the course. I would always try for a medical connection.
And that was new in the new school. They didn't have any.
Well, there was, eventually they got a medical anthropologist.
Yeah.
And then, once I was going in that direction, I said to myself, now, what kind of medicine would be nice? And I said, well, that was the medicine for old people, because in those days there was very little of that. So in a way, I found areas that were developing.
Hadn't you first suggested New Guinea?
Well, that was another thing. I was, eventually I had to choose a geographic area that I wanted to specialize in. And I was very interested in New Guinea, and the professor I talked about with said, are you going there? I said, no. He said, well, why choose it? And I said, well, I'm really interested in cosmopolitan modern society, and that was also something that anthropologists were just beginning to accept. So I had
More cultural anthropology or
any
more just
kind,
contemporary?
any kind of anthropology. No, it was not cultural. This was a focus area that you had to do. So I
Then you have to stand
eventually,
on a street corner once and
yeah, that was one of those.
that is
So basically, I finally graduated on a modern cosmopolitan society with a medical background and on old people. So, and I had a pretty good time with it.
But you, what did you do your thesis work on for your PhD?
Well,
that was
that's what I was just
No,
saying.
but the specific research that you
what
did.
I did was my subject matter was the speech difficulties that people who have who have Alzheimer's and who have brain injury have, and then their therapy, and also from an anthropological point of view, could you have a anthropological concentration on making the therapy work? And that was basically what it was.
And that was the research you did at the VA?
And I did the research at the VA.
and also the way they were
What?
taken when he came back. Also the way they were accepted after, how the family reacted. to them.
Who in the family would be responsible for care of this person, and
Yeah.
how that was culturally
That was
Well,
part of
that
it also.
was one of
determined
the-
as well?
But that was one of, well, to give an example, for instance, one of the problems that you have, what do you communicate about? And one of them could be things that the person was used to, his culture, his job, you know, that focus on part of a community. And I found that there were ways that you could do that. And also that the symptoms that they had, did they show, you know, that kind of background, and could you work with that?
So this, and what year did you get your degree?
Hmm?
What year did you get your PhD?
I think I actually passed my exam in 79, but I didn't get my diploma until 80,
I typed her thesis.
1980.
And then in the meantime, with your work, so you have the Vroman effect named for you, and your writing. You did a play, and you
Two
had
plays.
some awards, and life was felt pretty settled.
Yeah.
We were out of the house, so you were empty nesters.
Yeah, but it was, well, and the grants kept going on for quite a while, grants and contracts, well, I could add one thing maybe, that there are the Gordon conferences. There are conferences that are held in mostly New Hampshire, around there, in boys' colleges that were not being occupied in summer, and the rule is that nothing can be reported of it. You can't quote anybody who said anything. And one day, one of the more well-known organizers asked if I would do caricatures of the scientists in relation to the work they were doing. And that will be for the so-called lobster speech. There's always one evening that was open to the family of the scientists also, that was not strictly related to the work. So I did that, and
Was that sort of a keynote
yeah,
speech?
I like that a
Keynote
little
speaker,
bit.
sort of?
Yeah, and I made some people unhappy, but most of them liked it, I think.
And but you saved a lot of those.
Well, several of them have them hanging on the wall. So.
Mhm. So for some people who it was almost a badge of honor to have a caricature that you had done of them.
It worked out that way.
Yeah.
It was a badge of dishonor for one of them, I think. Well, I will not mention names, of course. He wanted to study. You were allowed to be extremely critical, so much so that the most critical person would be awarded a little statue of a two-headed dragon. And,
But you didn't get that.
no, but the man who I criticized got it once because he was extremely critical. And he was going to study the effect of metal on blood by putting metal in a container of blood, non-sterile, for about 3 weeks, I think, at 37 centigrade.
And then putting on a gas mask.
Somebody asked his assistant, well, didn't it degenerate? She said, well, you had to walk out of the room once in a while. So my question to him was, why didn't you use pea soup? And he said, well, why pea soup? And I said, what's the difference? So I made a caricature of him looking like a witch with a pointed hat and a big container with bats flying out of it.
And it surprised you that he was insulted?
Well, he was prepared.
Yeah. So, Mom, you were working for a while, and at what was the time frame then for your retirement from the VA, and you're working with patients, and because things started to go through the next transition, sort of the next phases for your lives too.
Yeah, wasn't it?
Finally, I did not get a grant, and I was
And when was this then? Your last grant expired?
1980 or so.
Yeah, something like
I would have to look at the back of the watch I got. There was a very nice system to award scientists by giving them the title of Research Career Scientist, at which point they didn't have to apply for anything anymore. They just did what they wanted to do. So after about 9 letters from other people, they were all very nice and all that sort of stuff, I got that title, but it turned out, well, actually, you still had to get a grant, and I didn't. And then I was going to be paid out of other people's grants, which was another system, and I didn't want to do that, so I said, no, but I better leave.
Well, you were already old enough for a pension then.
Oh, yes. So that stopped, and our friend Ed Leonard at Columbia asked me to work there for a while, and I did, on the same kind of subject, but a little more complicated. I had been extremely lucky. I might add this, maybe if it fits in. Right before I got my ellipsometer, which required a surface of chromium or so that is dipped 15 times into a film of barium stearate, which you had to create on the surface film balance that compresses this film. And after 15 dips, you got nice interference caused by the light being reflected by the bottom and by the top of this film. Very much like when you spill oil on asphalt, you get these colored rings, because the light is reflected by the top of the oil and the bottom. And these two beams interfere. Well, right before I got into this, we visited a cousin of mine, Vroman, who worked with at IBM making semiconductors using glass coated with tantalum and then anodized. And you got beautiful interference cores. And I asked if I could have any, and he gave me several, and they were perfect backgrounds, and you could use them forever.
And this, when did this start?
That was in 1961, 62.
So very early in your career
Yeah,
at the VA.
yeah. And I also discovered that you could stick it under a microscope and you got beautiful pictures. I put on stuff that I let dry and crystallize, and I took pictures of that, and I got a kind of a dramatic set that I used. I wrote little poems with, and that was published as with the title Just One More World. Also published by my publisher, Quaid. Later, when I ran out, I asked, it was on Bell Telephone, to get me some tantalum sputtered glass, and they did, and it didn't work out at all. And the conclusion was that the original tantalum used as a source that my cousin used was contaminated with something. I don't know what it was, but the result was that the anodized surface was beautiful.
Mm.
And that now it can still be imitated with silicon crystals with silicon oxide on top of it.
Mm. So when you were doing your additional research at Columbia, commuting several times a week from the bottom of Brooklyn up to practically the top of Manhattan, which was an hour and a half on the subway each way, and that's when you started your subway drawings?
Yes, I because you have to do something, I started drawing with ballpoint. You can, if you handle it very carefully, you can get pencil effects, lighter and darker shading. Once I was drawing, and there was a drunk lying on a bench next to me with a garbage bag, but he was trying to see what I was doing, so I held it up to him, and he said, "Very interesting, have you ever considered silver point, which is a medieval technique?" And I said, "No, it looks like silver point, but it's ballpoint." But many teenagers would come to rest, actually, where one would look and say, "Hey man, check this out." And the others would come and say, I would say always, "Oh, can you draw?" And they usually said, "No, I can't, but my brother or my cousin can draw very well."
Yeah. So how long did you decide to keep up that long commute, and do the work at Columbia?
Actually, we went on with that until we visited Peggy, our daughter, in Fort Worth, and we were obviously of an age to do something that would ensure permanent care. And one day she was going to show her in-law parents a place called Trinity Terrace, and why don't we come along? We came along, and even though I was always the one that made these rash decisions, like escaping from Holland or staying in New York, this time it was this woman who put a few questions. I didn't even get suspicious then yet, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Well, we're going to take it."
But were you still working at that time, or had you pretty much stopped?
No, well, I was about to stop. Well, we haven't talked about my work very much.
Yeah, we didn't mention Bellevue yet.
Yeah.
Well, I have the
Well, should we take a break, and then we'll start with Bellevue and then go on to the move down to Fort Worth?
Yeah.
Okay.